Welcome to the Autism Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Janine Hershkovitz, and it's my goal to help you create a more peaceful home while living with autistic and neurodivergent loved ones. Each episode, we focus on a different room in the house and help you create a peace plan for your home. So let's get started. Welcome, friends, to the Autism Blueprint Podcast. I'm thrilled to have you join us for this important episode where we dive into the critical topic of body safety education with the incredible Rosalia Rivera. Rosalia has dedicated herself to the work of empowering parents and children to understand their rights regarding their own bodies and body safety. So in our conversation, we explore what that means, what body safety means, how to start these essential discussions with children, and the importance of recognizing the signs of grooming so we can keep our kids safe. We're also going to touch on the unique challenges faced by neurodivergent families and how to adapt these teachings to different learning styles. So whether you're a parent or an educator or just someone interested in creating a safer environment for children, this episode is for you. So let's jump right in and learn how we can better advocate for our kids' safety and well-being. Well, Rosalia Rivera, thank you for being on the Autism Blueprint podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks again for inviting me.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to start with, I just want to jump right into some of the terms that you use on your Instagram, just to kind of introduce them to our audience. Body safety is a very big term that I see on both your website and on your social media. Tell us a little bit about what body safety is.
Sure. Yeah, so body safety, I use that term to make it friendly in terms of talking to kids. The term that I think most people are familiar with is abuse prevention education, but you know, saying that to a 5-year-old doesn't land really well. So body safety really helps them specifically to understand that what we're trying to teach them is how to learn to keep their bodies safe. So it's a term that I think it's a little bit more layman's term, even for other adults to try to understand, because when we say abuse prevention education, it kind of lands a little bit heavier. And so body safety is also a term that I like because it feels more empowering than to say abuse prevention education.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we start with teaching? Like, where do we start with teaching a child body safety?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, this really depends on where you're at in your parenting journey. You can start at any point. I always remind parents of that. You know, if your child's 13, it's not too late to start having these conversations. But if your child is as young as 2, that's a really great time to start, because this is when children typically will start to have more body awareness and have a better sense and understanding. I'm separate from my parent. They start to have more autonomy in terms of what they want to do with their bodies. So this is actually a really great time to just start introducing the idea of autonomy, so that when we introduce that, then we can start to talk about boundaries, and we can start to talk about consent and what that really means in terms of permission. You know, I think as a culture, we still look at consent as something related to sexuality, but it really is about permission and helping kids understand their own rights as well as the rights of others. So this is a really good foundation to then start talking about abuse prevention education, or as we know, body safety, so that we can help them prevent abuse, not just for our kids to do this work, because it's not their responsibility to prevent abuse, but so that they start having some awareness about their rights, what is safe and unsafe, and that they have an advocate in us to help them stay safe. So those are some of the preliminaries, and you can start as early as 2, but really at any point in your child's journey is a good time to start.
Okay. And how do you recommend with a practical example, how do we start?
Yeah. So, I mean, if your child's anywhere between 2 and 5, you can start with some of the basics of saying, you know, your body belongs to you. I didn't learn that when I was a kid. This might be true or not true for you, but however you want to express that part. For me, it was, you know, I didn't get to learn about that until I was almost an adult. And I think it was so important to learn that as an adult, but I wish I had learned it younger. And so now I really want you to learn this as young as possible, because when I was a kid, I didn't get a choice to hug or not hug, someone, whether it was a friend or a grandparent, so you can kind of use these examples. I always like for parents to kind of blend it into a story of ourselves as a kid, because it's much more
Mm.
interesting and engaging when kids hear stories, right? So if you can kind of go back to your own childhood and think about, how did you feel that you didn't have a lot of rights growing up, right? And that helps you translate that sort of idea and concept to your kids and say, but you are growing up in a different time, and I want you to know that you do have a right to say yes or no to hugs or kisses or tickling. If you don't want grandpa to pick you up, you have a right to say, grandpa, put me down. Or I don't want to be picked up. And so I want you to learn how to use your voice, and we're going to learn about what's this thing called boundaries, right? So you can kind of start introducing it in that way. And it really, I think when we narrate it as our own story, it gives a little bit more context for them to be able to process for themselves of, why is mom teaching me this, or why is dad telling me about this? So it helps them to understand the concept, but connect it to you and to them and to why this conversation is even happening, and that it's coming from a place of empowerment. So we don't have to start with, there's this thing that people might do to you. Like, we don't want to go down a fear-based path at all. So this can be a really empowering and engaging way to kind of open up that conversation.
Oh, that's a really great point, because you don't want to start with fear, right? You don't, especially for a 2 to 5 year old.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering if there are any parents out there that thought what I did when I first started entering this work, where my thought was, well, that's not going to happen to my kid.
Mm, yeah, for sure. This is unfortunately very common for parents who have never had these experiences in their own childhood. And when I say childhood, I want to remind everyone this includes adolescence all the way up to 19.
Yes.
So this could have happened, even if you were 16, it's still considered child sexual violence. But if you are a parent who's never experienced that, you may have this, what I call the NMK syndrome, not my kid syndrome, because it's very common to think that if you don't know the statistics. And the statistics based on where you live, in North America, it's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before the age of 18. And we know that those numbers are actually quite low compared to the reality, because most children don't report abuse until they are adults. So we know that these are underreported numbers. Likely much, much higher. But even if they were 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys, that's unacceptable. Those numbers are still quite high.
Yes.
And so we also need to understand that this isn't just an issue about adults. We're seeing that peer-to-peer rates of abuse are on the rise dramatically. So up to 70% of abuse is perpetrated by juveniles. And so when we think of, this happening to our kids, we tend to think, oh, I know all the adults in my kids' lives. Well, this could be happening by an older sibling, a cousin, a peer at school. So we really do need to become educated so that we don't fall victim to this not my kid syndrome, and not be aware of where the risks are so that we can be more proactive in preventing them.
Oh, that's really great. That is astonishing to me. 1 in 6 and 1 in 4. It's just unbelievable. And I believe you 100% when you say that a lot of it doesn't go reported, because as a psychotherapist, I have adults that come into my office and say, I need to unpack something I've never told anyone. And
Exactly.
it's heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking that person did not feel safe enough to tell someone or tell a parent. In your experience, why is that? What keeps children from telling?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think that's another misnomer, that adults think, well, if something's happening to a child, like, they will tell. They are uncomfortable, or they something violent happened to them. But unfortunately, there's multiple reasons, and this is one of the things that increases why children don't report. So the first one is that 90% of abuse happens by someone that the child knows and trusts. It's highly much more likely that a child will report if they were abused by a stranger. If they were taken, obviously, then the child, like, that's reported. But If the child knows the person 9 out of 10 times, this is a process of grooming, especially if it's by an adult. And so it's a gradual process where the child may not even realize that abuse is starting to happen, or they may feel complicit because of the way that they were groomed. And grooming, just to clarify, is essentially the strategies, the tactics that an offender will use to gain access to the family of the child,
Mm-hmm.
or just the child. Typically, it starts with the parents. Someone is grooming the child, the parents, to get access to the child. But if it's in a setting like a sport, or a maybe a religious organization or a school, they will be grooming the child directly. And so these are strategies to break down the boundaries, gain the trust and access to the child so that they can then abuse them. That these things happen so gradually, and a lot of times, because people aren't educated about what grooming is, they miss the signs where they could then intervene. But if someone has groomed a child, then they've taken the time to build a relationship with this child. And the child may feel loyalty to the person, so they don't want to report because they don't want to get them in trouble. They're hoping that the behavior will just stop. And if they, maybe just behave better or do what the person says, they'll eventually stop. So it can be an escalating issue where the abuse progresses, and then the child feels like, I should have told before. Now no one's going to believe me. So they may not feel like they're going to be believed. The person may have threatened them with violence or some other form of extortion. They may feel guilty that if they tell, especially if it's a family member, it will somehow break up the family and they will be at fault. So there's a number of reasons. Unfortunately for children, they don't know who they can tell, maybe, or that the person that they tell will be safe enough to tell.
Yeah.
There's so many more reasons that I can list, but it's very complicated for a child who is in a vulnerable position. They're not in a position of power. They don't know what they don't know. And so they may not recognize that it's even abuse that's happening if they haven't been educated. So abuse can be happening to the child and they don't know to report because that person has tricked them into thinking that it's appropriate behavior.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different reasons. And unfortunately, by the time a child recognizes that it's abuse, they may still fear a number of reasons why they shouldn't tell. They could be afraid that the person's going to go to jail and it's someone that they care about. They might fear, if it's a sibling, what's going to happen. So there's so many reasons, and this is why we need to educate our kids so that they know that it's safe to report and how to report safely.
Oh, that's such a good point. I'm so glad that you defined the actual meaning of grooming for us, because there are so many buzzwords that fly around social media and in the news and in pop culture. And grooming is one of the words that is so often misused.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Um, Thank you for clarifying that. How can parents ensure that their children aren't being groomed?
Yeah, so great question. I think it starts with, first of all, learning what the signs are. There's about 10 different ways that adults will groom children, or particularly parents first. And there are stages of grooming. So the first stage is really, first of all, defining, like, who are the people that are in positions of power with my child that could have the ability to groom. And this isn't to say be suspect of everyone,
Right.
but it is to say, be aware of who those people are so that if you see any of these subsequent signs, you can intervene, you can call it out, and not be afraid to, make sure that you're intervening by removing access to the child with that adult if you're seeing that pattern of signs. Some of these signs feel like, well, that's something that grandparents might do. And so I get that sentiment, but when we see a pattern of grooming signs along with your own gut feeling about something, I always say to parents, we are taught, from very young age to not listen to our gut and to dismiss that inner knowing that we have. And
Mm.
so I really encourage people to reconnect with that. Some of it, can come from fear or trauma. And so I understand, if you're like, I don't know if I can tell the difference. But when you see a pattern of these, then you'll get a sense of like, that's not appropriate, or maybe that's crossing the line, right? And so if you get a sense of that, it's because your body is trying to tell you to dig deeper. So when I say listen to your gut, it doesn't mean accuse someone. It means look deeper, right? So keep a closer eye, stay alert, stay aware, stay vigilant. Some of these grooming signs include things like gift giving, excessive gift giving, especially if it's outside of like birthdays or, holidays and things like that. But if you're seeing that, there's special attention being lavished on the child or even on the adult, again, it starts typically with the adult. So this might be someone who's offering, financial support or emotional support to the parent when or to the child when it might not be specifically necessary. You see that they're giving a lot of attention to the child particularly and trying to develop a special relationship with them. If you notice that they are being more physical, and this doesn't have to be inappropriate or sexual, it can just be, handling the child a lot. Either they pick them up a lot or they tickle them a lot. And if they're not, cluing into the body cues or facial cues of the child, but they're continuing to kind of push those boundaries, they're testing to see if the child or the adult will say anything, will step in and set the boundary. So they're testing to see, is this a parent who will step in and say something? Or is this a child who knows how to speak up and, say, I don't like this, or I don't want you to do that. So they will push those boundaries in order to, kind of break them down. Nobody's saying anything, so I'm going to keep pushing. And eventually that touch will become inappropriate and sexual. And again, if nobody has advocated for the child may be confused and say, well, nobody's saying anything to that, so then I guess this must be okay too. So, especially if the child is really young. So those are things you want to intervene on. If you see that your child's uncomfortable and that person didn't even ask for permission to tickle them or to pick them up or to, whatever it was, your job as an adult is to advocate. Hey, can you make sure you're asking? Or please read the facial cues. It doesn't seem like they're having a good time. Please stop. So you want to, set that and also model that for your child. But if you're seeing these kind of boundary crossings or boundary pushings, these are clues that that person's not really respecting your child's boundaries. They're kind of testing to see, and ultimately, if you're noticing that that person is really making an effort to ingratiate themselves with you or your child in ways that don't feel, appropriate, or they're borderline, those are times where you want to step in and be a little bit more vocal, especially about boundaries. I think any kind of offender who, whether they are a pedophile or a child molester, and there are differences, but regardless of these two, if you're noticing that they're doing these things and you push to say that's not okay, or please ask, or that doesn't seem appropriate, they will back off. They are looking for the easiest mark. And if you demonstrate that that's not you and your family, then you are reducing the risk of that person going after your child to groom them or to groom you as an adult. So there's a number of signs. I won't go through the entire list, but ultimately get educated, as much as you can about grooming. There's a really great book that I can recommend on the topic that just came out called Duck, Duck, Groom by Anna Sonoda. And it really goes in depth to help you understand what grooming is, how to address it if you see it, and then how to protect your child if you've started to see that these signs are coming up.
That is such good information. There are oftentimes also when family members are infringing on a child's boundaries and aren't necessarily trying to groom the child, but it's the culture of the family. So I grew up in a big Italian family. Hugs and kisses were not asked for. They were just forced upon you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never knew I could, I was never taught, oh, you can say, Grandpa, could you just back off? Pinching of cheeks and,
Oh, yes.
Yeah. What do we do about that?
Yeah, such a great question. So bringing it back to the practical, right? Because we can be aware of all these things and you're like, but grandma does that, right? So I think there's a couple of things. One is just be aware that this happens in many cultures. I'm Latin. I grew up very similarly. And, this was just the idea of children being seen and not heard. Children don't have rights. Like, these are cultural and societal issues that we're still grappling with today. And part of this work is really recognizing that we are being change makers. And that requires having the courage to have these conversations with the adults in our kids' lives, so that we can start shifting that culture. But when we step into a situation and kind of just demand this change, it can rub people the wrong way, especially if they don't understand the why. So what I always recommend is to be as proactive and preemptive about these things as much as possible before situations like family gatherings or family visits, especially with the holidays coming up. Get ahead of it. So have these conversations. I always recommend sending maybe a letter if you're not really comfortable having this conversation right up front, right away. It's kind of an icebreaker. You can, send a message, hey, we're coming over next week. I just wanted to let you know we started learning about body safety and what body safety is. And then you explain what it is, in a very short way that kind of just gives them a sense of like, oh, they're doing something new. I've never heard of this. Grandma might be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Then you can explain and say, we're starting to help our kids learn about body safety so that they learn how to be safe, because we just learned that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys experience sexual abuse before 18. We don't want our kids to become part of the statistic. So we're starting to get proactive about it. We're teaching them that their body belongs to them. And so what that means is that they're allowed to set boundaries. And we want to teach them to be respectful of others just as much as we want them to be respected. So what that means is that if you want to hug them or kiss them or tickle them, it may feel weird at first to ask, but we're asking you to help us be part of their safety team. So if you're calling people in instead of making them feel like you're calling them out, they're much more willing to be part of what you're doing and not feel, rejected, right? So part of it too is like, hey, Tommy might not want to hug. And I just want you to know, Tommy really loves you. It's not personal. They're just learning how to exercise their voice and their boundaries. We really appreciate you understanding and being part of it and like asking so that they, recognize it. But this is what we're doing. And if you have any questions, I'm totally here to help you, support you, help you work through it. We've told them that, they are not responsible for the emotions of adults. It doesn't mean we're trying to raise rude children. We want them to be respectful, but we also want them to know that their body safety really matters. So happy to talk to you more about this. I know you're going to have some questions. Let me know when you want to chat. So, if you do this ahead of time, it really sets the stage for hashing out any possible questions or issues that they might have. You might still have grandparents who are like, I don't agree with that, and this doesn't make sense to me. And your kid, nothing's going to happen to your child, and you may have others who completely dismiss it and decide to continue pushing boundaries anyway. And that is just information for you to go, okay, well, this isn't someone that I feel comfortable leaving my child with, or, let your child know, Uncle so-and-so isn't on board with this. And so if he picks you up and you're not okay with it, you totally have a right to call me, to say no, to say stop. So you want to really prepare both sides, your children and the adults, so that, they understand what the possibilities of what could happen, might be. And that way you have better communication with everyone before and during and after, right? Because afterwards you might have Uncle so-and-so who's like, tickled your child and your kid was pissed off and said stop and you had to intervene. And, unfortunately, family dynamics are always going to be a little bit bumpy at the beginning, and they may remain that way depending on the person. But I just want to remind parents that your child's safety is always the top priority. And as you're doing this work, you may come across people who will never agree, and that's okay too. You have a right to set the boundaries for your family, and you have the right to say, please don't pick up my child, or, if you see something actively happening, you can step in. Because again, this can be intervening a potential grooming situation, or it could just be, I've got to set the boundary and teach my child that it's okay to set the boundary. So we want to be advocates for our kids. when they can't be for themselves, especially in the beginning when they're just learning. So this does take some courage on our behalf. And I always recommend to parents to practice ahead of events. You've had the conversation and you anticipate there might be a couple of people who aren't on board with it. So practice with your partner or with a friend or in the mirror, how to set those boundaries on behalf of your kids, because they are watching too. And how you set your boundaries with others is going to help them learn how to set boundaries themselves as well.
Oh, that's such great information. And I often will give my clients a script that they can use. So you've given us some just amazing scripts that parents can start with. And I think that when they're empowered with the language to use, they're more likely to be able to do it
Right.
with a lot less distress. Um, our audience, as you may or may not know, is mostly autism and neurodivergent parents and professionals. And so this is something that I teach the parents that I work with very early on, because there are so many instances of families, extended families, not agreeing with, the type of parenting that, I may be doing or that they may be doing. So getting into this habit is a great idea for them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
While we're on the subject of neurodivergent families, um, is there anything different that you might do with a child or the parent of a child that is neurodivergent?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that we want to remember from the beginning, whether your child is neurodivergent or not. This really it encompasses all learning styles as well, because we have to remember how many times we have to repeat things for kids, right? For them to kind of either develop a habit or to just understand, right? And sometimes we have a certain context that we're coming from, that we may, if we don't understand our child's developmental stage, we may make the error of assuming that they understand something when they don't,
Mhm.
or assuming that, they learned it when they were 4, so by 8, they'll remember what you taught them, especially if we're not revisiting this. So there's two things that I want to first say is, one, try to use all 5 senses in trying to teach this material,
Hmm.
because you don't know what is going to land the most with your child, depending on if they're hearing it, if they're seeing it, if they're experiencing it like a felt experience, right? So, as an example, if you're teaching your child, your body belongs to you. So, if someone doesn't want a hug or a kiss, if you don't want a hug or a kiss from someone, you have a right to say no. So, that's pretty straightforward, like auditory instruction, right? But we want to use as many different senses as possible. So, as you're talking, you want to say, if you don't want someone to hug you, or if you don't want someone to kiss you, using body language to try to express, right? If you don't want someone, you can use your hand and say stop, or you can, use your arms and say stop, or you can nod your head, right? So really using as many physical features and engaging the body, asking them to play back those things so that you are, seeing if they understand what you're talking about. And then the next time that you bring up the topic, you can incorporate a book. So now you have
Mhm.
some more visual material that helps that message land. In the future, you might incorporate a video that might have a song attached to it, right?
Mm.
So you're using different parts of the brain that are being incorporated. There's so much more. There are so many more tools and resources today than ever before, specifically for kids, but also for the adults, right? To help them understand. There's this fantastic book that really breaks down touch, right? Because we tend to think of touch in really simplistic ways, but for kids with neurodivergence, like touch can mean, it's very specific, right? So is the touch painful, or was the touch hurtful, or was the touch pleasurable? So we really want to help them break down the different kinds of touch. So really trying to find as many resources as you can that incorporate all the senses and really tries to break things down in as many basic and simplistic ways, so that we are giving our kids an opportunity to ingest the information in a variety of ways, see what lands, and then kind of build on that. Like, oh, this, particular type of way of talking about it really landed more than this other one. This one, they didn't want to pay attention. It didn't, wasn't interesting at all, or they just didn't understand it. So I'm going to shift to this and see if this works. So really a lot of it is in the beginning, testing all the different ways in which you can incorporate this information and teach it. For me, I think one of the ways that works most effectively is when we're felt practicing it with our kids. So once you've got the basic information taught, then it's about making sure that we're practicing it with our kids, giving them an opportunity to make mistakes and be okay with making mistakes, and allowing them to also critically think on their own, so that you're not just feeding them the information, you're also asking them, what do you think? What would you do? What would you want to do? What would, if you couldn't do that, what else could you do? So really allowing them to process the information instead of us just kind of like, I always say it to some parents who feel nervous when they start talking about this, it can feel like verbal diarrhea, where you're just like, I'm just going to say everything that I can and hopefully some of this lands, right?
It's like a fire hose.
Yeah. So the other piece that's really important is to take your time. I think a lot of parents tend to feel like, I need to teach my child all of these things because I don't know, what they're going to need to know. And so it's a lot of it is a fear of like, I'm not sure what they should know at what point. So really, taking the time to learn about where your child is in their development, in their learning journey, testing different things to see what type of learning, what type of learner they are, right? So if it's like kinesthetic or auditory or visual learner, take some time to determine where is this information landing, so I can double down on that, then start to actually practice it in felt ways. So that can look like, almost intentionally in a low stake settings, crossing a boundary to see how the child will respond. So obviously this isn't an egregious boundary crossing, but it's something small where you want them to say no to something. You want to see how they're going to respond and will they be okay? So maybe go in for a little bit of a tickle. And if they are not okay with it, just kind of test, if I keep tickling, will they say no? And then if they're not doing it, you pull back and go, I noticed that you weren't really into it. How come you didn't say no? You're always welcome to say no, even to mom. So we want to keep reiterating these kinds of things. And then just keeping things as simple as possible as you move through this journey, and take your time moving through it. So it doesn't have to be rushed. Your kids, our job as adults is to prevent abuse. So we have to be on that front line while our kids are learning. We don't want to put the pressure on them to try to teach them everything at once so that they prevent abuse. We certainly want them to recognize that we are their advocate and what is inappropriate, but we don't want to put that pressure on them. And so, because a lot of times what happens is parents think, I have to, my kid's going to go to school, I've got to teach them all these things. And the child isn't absorbing it because it's like a fire hose of information, and they're not really retaining it. They've got some of the information. And then if something happens, the parent feels like they failed, because what really they could have been doing is being more proactive with the adults or other friends or peers. So this would look like your kid's going to school. Your job would be have a conversation with the teacher, let them know what you're teaching at home, get some information about what, the classroom culture looks like and what body safety rules they have. Do they even teach it as a curriculum? So this is the work that parents need to be doing as well, not just strictly teaching their kids. So I always say it's a 50-50 approach when your kids are really young and you're just starting, so that you don't feel that pressure of like fire hosing your child with all the information.
Yeah, I love those examples. And my son, who has autism and he is verbal but doesn't communicate primarily through words all the time. And he's in his mid-20s. The other day, even like I can say, because he's in his mid-20s, when he was little, I didn't teach this stuff. I didn't even think he understood when I spoke. Right. So I'm playing catch up now, but I'm doing it in a way where, I asked him yesterday if I could have a hug, and he said no. And I said, good job. And he just looked at me, and I said, you don't have to say yes to hugs all the time, even if they're from mommy. And I noticed that about 2 minutes later, he came over and said, want to have a hug. So
That's
he
awesome.
asked me because he was like, "Oh, I feel like I need a hug now." But it's fine that 5 minutes ago you didn't want it and
Right.
now you're asking for one. That's totally fine. Like,
Right.
you get to decide that. So I'm trying to like weave it in now because I never really explicitly taught it before.
Hmm.
But I think it's always a great idea to teach things in real time
Yeah,
with our kids, right? When they mess
absolutely.
up, rather than flying off the handle, to be able to just say, "Hey, let's talk about this." Because if we're the kind of parent that's always flying off the handle and always showing their excessive stress, that child isn't going to come to us with those huge issues.
Exactly.
They're
Exactly.
just not going to feel safe enough.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think a majority of adults, because of how we were raised, are not really good at setting boundaries. I think adults are still trying to navigate, autonomy and
Oh,
boundaries and consent as adults, right? And
yes,
so I think that,
100%.
yeah, so I think that it's great that, even at this stage, you're starting to talk about it. Like I said before, it doesn't matter the age of your child. This is
Mhm.
always a topic that we need to help kids and adults learn more about. Like, as parents
Yeah.
talking to other parents, they're probably unaware and uneducated and don't have great boundaries or have excessive boundaries. You may have people who have like completely shut down because they didn't have the ability to set boundaries. So it's just easier to just keep people out altogether. And
Yeah.
so we don't want kids to, have the experience of, I don't know how to set boundaries, so I'm just going to not engage. And so ultimately, what you're doing now is fantastic. And the idea of autonomy is not actually, it's not as common as you think. Like, most people don't really fully understand their rights. They're afraid of setting boundaries because they think it's going to sever the relationship or it's going to harm the relationship. Or someone's not going to like them if they're people pleasers. That's a very hard thing to do, right? To set those boundaries. So when we learn how to do it, we are actually going to teach our kids better because we can do it from a felt place. So even when we learn this and we start practicing it with our kids, we start to get better at it ourselves. So, I love that this practice helps adults and kids get better at learning, how to speak, how to use their voice, how to set boundaries,
Yeah.
and to be able to, have a better relationship with everyone in their life because of it. It really does bring more peace, harmony, and less violence into our lives.
Mm, I love that. Um, Previously you mentioned the word pedophile. That's another buzzword similar to grooming that's been used in ways that are completely inappropriate. Um, can you give us a definition?
Yeah, so pedophiles, and there's different subsects of it, but according to the DSM-5, I believe it's called, diagnosis, it's the American Psychiatric Association, I believe,
Ah,
book.
yes, the DSM.
The DSM. Okay, I always say it's the DSM because I think the current version is 5, so it's the
It is,
DSM
yeah,
5. Okay.
yeah.
So according to that definition, it is a person with a innate attraction to children, and the term innate is still, I think, under debate.
Mhm.
But without, kind of going down that rabbit hole, it is a person who has an attraction towards children that is compulsive. So it is more inherent within what they deem as their sexuality. Um, However, I think a lot of people throw this term around and think, anyone who has harmed children is a pedophile. And that's not actually true. You can have someone who is a sex offender who can also harm children because it is they are an opportunistic sex offender. So this means that they are willing to offend on anyone regardless of age. And a lot of times, unfortunately, children become their mark because they are a vulnerable and easy target. So you can have someone who is a heterosexual adult that is not specifically just attracted to children who could still offend and abuse a child. And most of the time, when people hear that someone has either consumed child sexual abuse material, previously known as child porn, or if they did, molest or abuse a child, they automatically call them a pedophile, even though they might be someone who's married with kids. If they aren't innately just attracted to children. So there is a distinction. Also, not all pedophiles are abusers. So you may have someone who has this diagnosis, and they may have diagnosed themselves. They recognized early on, I don't understand why, but I seem to be attracted to children. And they recognize the ethical and moral issue with that and want to find a way to not harm children. So you may have non-offending pedophiles. I know that recently there's also been this term MAPS, which was termed MAPS because it stands for minor attracted person. And there's been a lot of controversy around that term because it was a term that seems to have been developed to destigmatize people with attractions towards children so that they can get help, so that they, if they self-identify as that, they can go and seek support and it won't be stigmatized. Hopefully a therapist or a mental health professional can help them find, treatments or strategies to make sure that they're not harming children. However, I don't agree with that term. I think that we should not, as a society, move towards that term. But I think that's a whole other conversation for another day. But that, it is important to understand and distinguish that a pedophile is someone who has an attraction to children. They can be an offending pedophile or a non-offending pedophile. And you may have a heterosexual or a homosexual person. Their adult sexuality does not necessarily prevent them from harming children if they are an offender of any type. So
I would like you to say that louder for the people in the back, because you don't know how many times I have to educate people in my office that homosexuality in and of itself, sexual preference, gender identity, none of that has anything to do in the research with being a pedophile or an offender.
Right.
Would you agree?
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
And I think this is one of the reasons why, unfortunately, and if you look back and do any kind of research, you'll see that there are organizations, for example, like NAMBLA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with NAMBLA.
Yes. Yes.
NAMBLA stands for I think it was the National Association of Boy Lovers or something like that. Yep. So they were around for a long time. I think from the 70s. I think kind of just went underground on the dark web at this point, but they were around from the 70s and on. And this was an organization that very vocally said, we believe that children should have the right to choose if they want to be sexual with adults, and adults aren't necessarily trying to harm kids. They were making this whole argument, which was absolutely ridiculous and bogus.
Ridiculous. Yes.
And so, unfortunately, though, this organization really tried to connect itself with the LGBTQ community. In the early 70s and 80s, it was still just the LGB community, that they really tried to attach themselves and say, we are a sexual orientation as well. We should be included in this umbrella. And so they really worked hard. This organization, along with many others around the world that were kind of trying to come out in a way, were really trying to attach themselves under the umbrella of the LGBTQ. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of roots to offenders who have, if you look back, you can say that Freud was associated with a pedophile. There's a lot of history that I think we need to look at about even someone like Kinsey and how he, got his information. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I think I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that there have been a lot of pedophiles or child molesters who have kind of tried to normalize, and I think that movement is still very much thriving, who have tried to normalize this and have tried to attach themselves to the LGBTQ community. And unfortunately, this is why that has kind of been convoluted at this point. And I think the LGBT community is trying their best to disassociate, but there are so many segments of the community that are speaking about different aspects of this. So I think a lot of people don't know, is someone who is trans actually, interested in children, or are drag queens? There's like this whole controversy of like, are drag
Right.
queens safe? And I think the goal that for me as an educator of this kind of work, I think it's important that we understand that any kind of sexuality, whether it is heterosexual, homosexual, or anything in between, is are topics that are meant for a certain segment of age groups, right? So we need to start with the basics of helping kids understand where they are in their sexual journey. Children from a very young age, do understand. They start to get body awareness. They do start to understand. Oh, these areas of my body are more sensitive than others. We want kids to have not just body safety, but body literacy, and those are the basic sort of foundations of sex education. I think where these lines get crossed is when we are starting to educate children on topics that they don't necessarily need to learn about at certain stages.
Yeah.
And that we are introducing sexualized topics at times when children aren't there yet. So I think
Yes.
that this is part of the controversy, is like, are we sexualizing children before they should be sexualized, or be learning about these topics? We have to
Yes.
understand that the media in general is doing this already. And
Yes.
that's, to me, the bigger focus. Like, yeah, I would not take a child to a drag show, but I don't have an issue necessarily with drag time story hour at the local library. I
Right.
think that when we have an adult entertainer who is, bringing in sexuality to a performance, then that's not appropriate. And that goes against
Right.
the things that we're teaching. But that doesn't mean that a drag queen is inherently a sexual predator towards children. So I think we need to be really clear and educated ourselves before we make these grandiose statements that can harm an entire community, and also be harming children if we are just taking one side versus the other. I think these are very nuanced conversations that we shouldn't just be throwing around without having more information and education, because one, we could not be protecting children when we should be, and we could be harming individuals that are actually safe. So I think it's really important to be nuanced and educated about this topic before we make rash judgments.
Oh, 100%. I'm so glad that you mentioned considering where a child is in their sexual development, because I don't know, back in my day, probably yours too, we didn't really learn about our bodies until we were about to go through puberty,
Right,
kind of like on a need to know basis.
right.
And I think, just a lot of the and I am not, don't come after me guys, I'm not picking on religion, but what I want to say is a lot of religious communities that focus on purity culture are
Hmm.
talking to kids in a church setting, in a religious setting, about things that kids don't need to know about right now. I
What?
mean,
So
what do you
what
experience
do
with
you
that?
mean exactly?
Well, so if we're telling a 7 or 8-year-old, don't have sex before marriage, you must get married before you engage in any sexual activity, suddenly, kids are coming home and going, "Mom, what's this? What's that?
Yeah.
What's,"
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I grew up Catholic, and I was
Yes,
raised, with the idea that sex was sinful, and we didn't talk about it. It was a very
yes.
sex negative environment. So much like you, I did not learn about my body or about sexual health until I was into my late teens. It wasn't a conversation I could even ask my mom about. So even whatever I learned at school, I didn't really feel comfortable asking my mom any sort of follow up questions. And unfortunately for me, I went down the path of as many other young people do, of looking it up in whatever way I could. And at the time, it was the 90s. So for me, it was like HBO at night, like
Yeah.
I forgot the name of the show, but it was like, not age appropriate. It probably was,
No.
not really the best way for me as a young adult or a young teen to be learning about these topics. So I think it's really important that, first of all, we destigmatize the topic.
Mhm.
Sex, can be something that can be an incredibly amazing experience. It can also be a very traumatizing experience. So really, it comes down to helping kids learn about these topics in a way that is age appropriate and safe, that is developmentally appropriate. So what that means is, yeah, we want to be teaching kids about their bodies, body literacy. We want them to have a healthy sense of self about their bodies. And that means destigmatizing things like menstruation, right? We don't have to wait until, the child starts to menstruate to then talk about it. If we prepare them ahead of time and let them know. And this is for, regardless of gender. I think that, we tend to think like, oh, I don't have to teach my son about this. But actually, if you are a mom, if you're a menstruator, then this is something that, regardless of gender, children should learn about. This is reproductive health. So it really, I think we have to look at what is age appropriate to be teaching. When does my child need to learn this? How can I start having these conversations in safe ways? Because the truth is that at younger and younger ages, we need to talk to our kids about what porn is, so that if they accidentally come across it or intentionally seek it out, that they are understanding that this is not appropriate content for them to watch, that it's not realistic, that it is, there's a lot of problems, particularly with mainstream porn, that are harmful for developing brains. And so if we can't explain to them what sex is, then we have a much harder time explaining what porn is. We have to have these really basic conversations. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be teaching your kids the mechanics of sex. You're not, I think that there's this fear of like, if I teach my child about this and they're going to go off and want to do it, most of the time kids are not interested. Like I had my son has come and asked me like, what is this? And then I got really nervous, even though I know okay, this is a topic that I need to talk about. They heard it on the playground. They were asking what it was. And fortunately I had some, basic conversations already about what sex was. So I was able to explain this in a very basic way. And then they were like, not interested. Like I was ready to like read them the whole, age appropriate explanation. But it was like, oh, okay, well, never mind, like whatever. And they just, went off and like were interested in the next thing. Like it wasn't a big deal. They're not interested in it. A lot of the times they're going to be like, that's gross. And they have no more interest in hearing any more about it. So, there's lots of things that we should be talking about, and just allowing our kids to know I'm a safe resource for you to come to ask about these things. So if you hear something on the playground, if somebody said something, if you don't know what this is, come talk to me first. Like, don't go to the internet. Hopefully you have some filters in place for your, at home with your devices, and your kids are safe in that way. But, they have friends, or there's devices at school that aren't always locked down. So you got to have these conversations at earlier ages. Unfortunately, there's so many great resources. Good Pictures, Bad Pictures is a great book for that. But this is, these are things that if we're not talking to our kids about it, guess what? The rest of the world is. Whether it is, the music that they listen to, the YouTube videos that they're watching, the movies, the books, the conversations in the playground, the exposure that their friends might have had from an older sibling. Like, it is an onslaught that is coming at you, and it's coming at your child. And if you're not the one leading these conversations, everyone else is having them with your child. You just don't know about them. So, I wholeheartedly believe that it's important that we have good values around autonomy, boundaries, consent, sexuality, that we are the ones that are helping our kids navigate that world safely and in a shame-free way. We don't need them to feel guilty about this knowledge, because then it's just going to go underground, and they're not going to feel safe coming to you to ask. So it's a really important topic.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I want to be mindful of your time. So the last question that I ask everyone that comes on is, if every autism parent were listening, what would you want them to know?
I would like them to know that, unfortunately, your child is actually at a higher risk for abuse, because offenders do seek out the targets that are the easiest. And so this is why it's even more important for you to get educated on this topic, and for you to be an advocate for your child. and of course, to help them learn how to self-advocate and learn what's safe and not safe. But make sure that you are staying proactive, because the statistics show that children with disabilities or neurodivergence are at higher risks for abuse. So be proactive, get educated, and know that this is an empowering journey. It doesn't have to be scary. It's not riddled with, obstacles for you. It actually, there are so many tools and resources available today, particularly for children with neurodivergence, that can help. So, I hope that that's an encouraging note to end on, because you do have the power to reduce the risk for your children.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I will link to as many resources as I can in the show notes, including your website and your Instagram, which are just amazing. I mean, I spent like an hour on your website one day just going down that rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, I don't know what I don't know. And you do coaching as well with parents, so they can get all that information there, and I'll definitely link to that. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again for having me, and I loved our conversation.
Same here. Take care.
The information in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional.